"I never had a daughter," my mum said to her friend while I sat right next to her. She laughed and added, "Just a mistake I regret." 10 years later, I stood at her will reading as her only heir. Everyone turned to me when I said, "You may not claim me, but your millions did." The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Matthews living room, casting golden patterns across the expensive rugs and meticulously polished floors. Claire sat quietly on the edge of the armchair, her hands resting in her lap, fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. She wasn't part of the conversation. She was just present, as she had been taught to be, seen, not heard. Her mother, Deborah, was seated across from her, her posture regal, her tone confident as she entertained an old friend who had dropped by unexpectedly. 17 already? The friend had remarked earlier. Time really flies. Deborah had laughed softly, that practiced social kind of laugh Claire had heard 1,000 times. Then came the words that shifted the air in the room, words Claire would remember for the rest of her life. "I never had a daughter," Deborah said lightly, taking a sip of her tea. "Just a mistake I regret." The room fell silent for a moment. Claire felt the breath in her throat turn sharp and thin, like glass shards pressing into her chest. She sat still, not out of courage, but out of disbelief. Surely she had heard wrong. Surely it was a joke or something else. But Deborah went on, chuckling with her friend, as if she had merely commented on the weather. The friend gave an awkward smile, her eyes darting toward Claire, then quickly away. No one corrected the statement. No one reached for Claire. She was not acknowledged, not even as a presence in the room. The rest of the conversation blurred into a buzz of words that no longer reached Claire's ears. She stared at her mother's face, searching for a flicker of something, remorse, hesitation, discomfort, but found only the same cool elegance that had defined Deborah for as long as Claire could remember. Everything about her mother was always polished, her speech, her clothing, her carefully curated circle of acquaintances, and now, apparently, her version of the truth. When the friend finally left, Deborah rose from her chair without looking at Claire. She smoothed her blouse and walked toward the kitchen, humming faintly as she did, leaving Claire alone in the silence. No explanation, no glance backward. Claire remained seated, unmoving, until the light faded and the room grew dim. Her mind played the moment over and over, searching for any other meaning, but none came. The words had been plain, intentional, final. That night, Claire lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. Her chest felt heavy, like something had collapsed inside her. She tried to remember a time when her mother had said, "I love you," or held her without stiffness. Memories came, but they were hollow. Images of birthdays with perfect cakes and expensive gifts, but no warmth. Christmas mornings with orchestrated smiles. School plays where Deborah clapped politely, but left before the final bows. There had always been a distance. Now it had a name. Mistake. The next morning, Deborah acted as if nothing had happened. She reminded Claire of a dentist appointment and left for a charity luncheon. Claire responded only with a nod, her voice lost somewhere deep in her. At school, Claire told no one. She smiled when expected, turned in her homework, and took careful notes. She laughed with friends when necessary, but it felt like acting. Everything felt like acting now. She began to wonder if her entire life had been one long performance, staged to meet her mother's standards, but never good enough to be real. Days passed, then weeks, and still, Deborah never mentioned the conversation. Claire began to observe her mother more closely, trying to read the spaces between her words. But Deborah was a master of control. If she felt anything about what she had said, it was buried beneath layers too deep for Claire to uncover. By the end of the month, Claire stopped trying to understand. She began to write in a notebook she kept hidden beneath her mattress, not poems or diary entries, just words she needed to say to someone, anyone. Sometimes she wrote to herself, sometimes to a future version of herself, and sometimes, though it made her feel foolish, she wrote letters to a mother who might one day care. But the house remained quiet. Deborah remained unchanged. And the words, "Just a mistake I regret," never left Claire's mind. They became the silent rhythm of her days, a quiet pulse behind every smile she forced, every conversation she endured. She didn't cry, not once, not because she wasn't hurt, but because tears felt like they would give her mother more power. Claire would not be broken in ways that showed. She would survive, even if she had to do it alone. Claire moved through the halls of Fairview High with the same deliberate silence that filled her home. On the surface, nothing had changed. She still arrived early, sat in the front row during lectures, and kept her notes in perfect order. Teachers praised her focus, classmates admired her calm, and no one noticed the difference. But inside her, the wound pulsed constantly, invisible to the world, but impossible to escape. The words her mother had spoken had not faded. If anything, they had taken root, weaving themselves into every corner of her thoughts. It wasn't just what had been said, it was the way it had been said. Effortless, final, true in her mother's eyes. At home, the air was colder than usual. Deborah maintained her routines as if nothing had happened. She hosted dinners, attended board meetings, updated her social calendar, and moved through the world with her usual poise. If she noticed that Claire barely spoke, she gave no sign. If she wondered why her daughter avoided eye contact or answered in clipped phrases, she did not ask. The silence between them grew like a wall, tall, smooth, and impenetrable. Claire spent her afternoons in the small sunroom that looked out over the garden. It was the only place in the house where she felt remotely safe. Surrounded by soft cushions and old books, she could pretend for a few hours that she belonged to herself. Sometimes she sketched. Other times she read novels she borrowed from the public library, stories filled with people who hurt each other. Yes, but also apologized, also forgave. None of them reminded her of Deborah. The pain didn't come in sharp bursts, but in quiet, steady waves. It was in the way Deborah walked past her without acknowledgement. It was in the empty seat next to her at dinner. It was in the absence of small talk, of good nights, of concern. Claire stopped asking for rides, stopped mentioning her test scores, stopped pointing out when she was leaving or arriving. Her mother never asked anyway. What made it worse was the contradiction. To everyone else, Deborah Matthews was a model parent. She donated generously to the school, attended charity luncheons and hosted elegant fundraisers in the name of children's health. She was featured in magazines, quoted in local interviews, praised for her devotion to the community. Strangers sent letters thanking her for her leadership. Claire, reading those clippings in the kitchen while eating alone, would feel something twist in her chest. Not anger, not jealousy, just confusion. How could someone so revered be so distant? How could she inspire so much warmth from others and offer none to the one person who needed it most? One evening, while returning home from an art club meeting, Claire found herself hesitating at the front door. The house beyond it was large and silent, filled with polished furniture and polished lies. She stood on the porch for a long time, watching the lights flicker behind the curtains, knowing her mother was inside, probably seated with a glass of wine and a book she wouldn't finish. Claire didn't expect a greeting, but the thought of entering felt heavier than usual. When she finally pushed the door open, Deborah didn't look up. "You're late," she said mildly, not bothering to glance away from the fireplace. Claire didn't answer. She slipped off her shoes and walked upstairs without another word. That night, she lay awake again, staring at the shadows on her ceiling. The phrase circled her like a ghost. "Just a mistake, I regret." She whispered it aloud once, just to see how it sounded in her own voice. The words tasted bitter. She imagined saying them to someone else, a friend, a child. Even in theory, it hurt. How had Deborah said it so easily? Over the following weeks, Claire began to wonder if something had always been wrong between them, something she had never noticed because she had grown up thinking it was normal. The absence of hugs, the careful distance, the way Deborah's compliments felt like formalities, not warmth. Maybe, Claire thought, this moment wasn't a rupture, it was a confirmation. Maybe the mistake had always existed, and the only difference now was that her mother had finally said it aloud. Still, Claire couldn't ignore the longing that remained. Even after everything, a part of her still hoped Deborah would knock on her door one evening and say something, anything, that hinted at regret or recognition. That moment never came. Instead, the silence continued, unbroken and complete. Claire's journal began to fill more rapidly. She no longer wrote only late at night. She carried it with her, hidden beneath textbooks or tucked into her backpack. Between classes or on the bus, she jotted down sentences that came to her uninvited. Not always sad, but always true. Words she didn't want to forget. Thoughts that helped her survive. One entry read, "I am not her mistake. I am just someone she never tried to understand." Another, "Even unwanted things grow. I'm still growing." Art became her sanctuary. Her sketches darkened in tone, less flowers and landscapes, more portraits with smudged eyes and heavy shadows. Her art teacher, Mrs. Landry, began to notice. She said nothing at first, just gave gentle feedback and encouraged Claire to keep going. One afternoon after class, she paused beside Claire's easel and looked at her latest piece, a faceless figure surrounded by a wall of mirrors. "You're saying something important," Mrs. Landry said softly. "You should keep saying it." Claire nodded, not trusting herself to speak. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, not entirely, but enough. At home that evening, Deborah was out again. Claire ate alone, did her homework, and returned to the sunroom. The silence felt less hostile now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She was beginning to understand that waiting for Deborah to see her might be pointless. And maybe that was the real wound, the realization that some parents do not grow into love no matter how much time they're given. But Claire would. She would become the kind of person who did not turn away from pain, who did not call her child a regret. She would carry this wound, yes, but it would not define her. It would shape her art, her voice, and one day, perhaps, her freedom. It was the first Saturday of spring when Claire found herself in the attic. The task had not been her idea. Deborah, in her usual distant tone, had asked her to help clear out old junk before the seasonal cleaning crew arrived. Claire almost refused, but something about the hollow sound of her mother's voice that morning made her curious. It was rare that Deborah spoke directly to her at all, even rarer that she asked for help. And so, without a word, Claire followed her up the creaking stairs. The attic was larger than she remembered. Dust motes floated in beams of sunlight that sliced through the small grime-covered window near the roof. Stacks of boxes lined the far wall, each marked with faded labels: winter decor, old curtains, toys, donated. Deborah pointed vaguely at the piles and muttered something about separating what was useful from what could be discarded before she descended again, leaving Claire alone. She began sorting through the boxes slowly, her fingers brushing against old photo albums, tarnished silver, and forgotten trinkets from a life that felt as curated and distant as a museum exhibit. Each object whispered of a past where everything was beautiful and pristine, but nothing was warm. After an hour, just as she was preparing to close one of the deeper shelves, she noticed a box tucked behind a stack of antique frames. It was small, plain, and unlike the others, not labeled. Her name was scrawled across the lid in ink that had faded almost to invisibility. Claire. Her breath caught. She touched the lid lightly, as if it might vanish under her fingertips. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were a series of carefully folded letters, a hospital bracelet, and several photographs she had never seen before. The bracelet was hers, tiny, plastic, with her name printed in careful block letters, followed by the date of her birth. The photo showed her as a baby, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, asleep in someone's arms. Most of the photos were taken in a sterile hospital room, but what drew Claire's attention was the final letter, placed neatly on top of the others, as if someone had meant for it to be found last. The handwriting was familiar, Deborah's. The ink had bled slightly into the paper, but the message remained clear. "Dear Claire, I'm writing this because I don't know how to say it to you directly. Maybe I never will. Maybe you'll never even read this. But I need the words to exist somewhere, even if only on this page. When you were born, I expected to feel something that never came. I expected the world to shift, to glow, to fill me with a sense of purpose and love like everyone described. Instead, I felt numb, lost, like I had stepped into a life that belonged to someone else. It wasn't your fault. You were perfect. But I wasn't ready. And I didn't know how to become the mother you deserved. I thought time would fix it. I thought love would grow. But instead, I buried the discomfort and performed the role, hoping it would eventually feel real. It didn't. And that makes me feel like a failure, because you deserved more." Claire read the letter twice, then 3 more times, her eyes tracing every line as if searching for something that wasn't there. An apology, perhaps, or affection. But all she found was honesty, raw and unfiltered, and more painful because of it. Deborah hadn't hated her. She hadn't even resented her exactly. She simply hadn't known how to love her. The distinction mattered, but it didn't soften the hurt. She placed the letter beside her and lifted one of the photos. In it, Deborah held her as a newborn, her face turned slightly toward the window, away from the camera. There was no smile, no tenderness in her expression, only blankness. Claire looked at the image for a long time, trying to find something she could hold on to, some evidence that she had ever been wanted. Later that day, when she came downstairs with the box in her arms, Deborah was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. She turned when she saw Claire but said nothing, her eyes falling on the box like it was a stranger that had broken into their home. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice sharp and unfamiliar. "In the attic," Claire replied. "Behind the old mirror frames." Deborah stared at the box, her jaw tight. "That wasn't meant for you. You put my name on it. That was years ago. I forgot it was even there." Claire waited for her to say more, but Deborah just turned away, placing the glass on the counter with more force than necessary. For a moment, Claire thought she might say something, anything, but all that followed was silence, not even an attempt at explanation, let alone comfort. She took the box to her room and locked the door. That night, Claire sat on the floor with the contents spread out around her. The letters were old, written over several years, most undated. They spoke of fear, of loneliness, of an internal battle between the person Deborah pretended to be and the woman who felt trapped in a role she had never wanted. Claire didn't know whether to feel sympathy or anger. She felt both, and neither. More than anything, she felt a strange kind of clarity. Her mother had never understood her, but more than that, Deborah had never understood herself. For the first time, Claire stopped blaming herself. She had always wondered what she had done wrong, why she hadn't been enough, why her presence seemed to irritate more than inspire love. But the truth was simpler, if sadder. The problem had never been Claire. It had always been the distance Deborah kept around her own heart. That realization didn't heal the wound, but it changed its shape. The next day, Claire returned the box to the attic. She placed it back in the same spot, not out of fear, but out of choice. She didn't need to keep it with her. She had already absorbed what it had to teach. From that point on, she stopped waiting for her mother to change. Spring passed into summer with little change inside the Matthews household. Outside, the trees bloomed and the days grew longer, but within the polished walls of their grand home, the silence between Claire and Deborah deepened. It was no longer just the absence of conversation. It was a steady, deliberate detachment, the kind that thickens like fog until it coats every surface and swallows every sound. Claire no longer tried to decode her mother's moods or behaviors. After finding the letters in the attic, she had stopped pretending there was something to salvage. Whatever had been broken between them was not a result of some temporary rift or isolated comment. It was a lifelong fracture, one that had simply been hidden beneath layers of decorum and routine. Deborah didn't hate her, but she had never loved her in the way a child needs to be loved, and that truth, once understood, was impossible to forget. They still shared the same space. They still sat at the same table for dinner when Deborah was home. They exchanged brief, hollow words when logistics demanded it. What time Claire would be home from school, when the cleaning service was coming, whether the alarm had been set. But these were not conversations. They were transactions, quiet exchanges between two people who shared a roof but not a bond. Claire began spending less and less time at home. After school, she stayed in the art room longer than necessary, helping Mrs. Landry clean up supplies or rearrange student displays. The art teacher never asked questions she didn't already know the answers to. She simply gave Claire space to exist, space that was safe, unjudged, and honest. When the weather permitted, Claire wandered through the town's small park, sketchbook in hand, drawing strangers' faces from memory, capturing fleeting expressions that felt more genuine than anything she received at home. Her friendships grew deeper during this time, not because she spoke about what had happened. She never told anyone about the box or the letter or the words her mother had said that day, but because she began to understand the value of closeness. The contrast between what she lacked at home and what she found in her friendships sharpened her awareness. She didn't take small gestures for granted. A laugh shared over lunch, a friend texting just to ask if she made it home safely. Even the casual touch of someone brushing her arm while talking became something she clung to. These small connections mattered. They reminded her that she was not invisible to everyone. Still, the pain lingered. It surfaced in strange ways. Nights when she couldn't sleep. Mornings when her chest felt too tight to breathe easily. Some days the world felt muted, as if all the colors had been drained. Her art reflected this shift. Her pieces became darker, more abstract. Shapes fragmented, faces blurred, lines broke off before completion. Mrs. Landry never asked her to explain the change. She simply told Claire to keep creating, to let the work carry what the words couldn't. One afternoon in July, while organizing a display for the summer art showcase, Mrs. Landry pulled Claire aside and handed her a flyer. It was for a scholarship competition hosted by a private art college in another state. The opportunity was competitive, but the reward was full tuition and a living stipend for 4 years. "You should consider this," Mrs. Landry said. "Your work deserves to be seen." Claire stared at the paper in her hands. Leaving Connecticut had always felt like a distant dream, one she kept hidden under layers of doubt and restraint. But now, with every step at home feeling heavier, the idea of leaving started to seem less like an escape and more like a beginning. When she brought it up at dinner that evening, Deborah didn't even look up from her salad. "Out of state," she said coolly. "You'll never afford that, even with a scholarship. And it's just art, hardly a career." Claire said nothing. She folded the flyer and placed it under her plate, waiting for the meal to end. She had not asked for permission. She hadn't needed Deborah's encouragement. But still the dismissal stung, not because it was unexpected, but because it was delivered so casually, as though her dreams were too insignificant to deserve a reaction. That night, Claire sat by her window, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. She thought of all the things she would never hear from her mother. Not congratulations, not support, not pride. And she realized something else too. She didn't need those words anymore. She wanted them, yes. But she no longer believed that wanting made her weak. She spent the next week building her application. She selected her strongest pieces, wrote an artist's statement that read more like a confession than a resume, and mailed it with no expectation of what might follow. The act itself was enough. It was the first decision she had made purely for herself, unfiltered by her mother's gaze. In the days that followed, she spoke even less to Deborah. There was no point in trying to bridge a gap that had taken 17 years to form. Deborah, for her part, didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she preferred it that way. The silence suited her, neat, manageable, void of emotion. The rift between them widened, not through shouting or arguments, but through mutual neglect. Each retreated further into their own world. Deborah with her functions, her public image, her glass of wine, at precisely 6 o'clock in the evening. Claire with her pencils, her sketchbook, her long walks through town. By the end of summer, they lived like shadows under the same roof, rarely colliding, never overlapping. And still, neither of them said what needed to be said. The acceptance letter arrived on an ordinary Thursday, tucked between catalogs and utility bills, bearing a simple university seal on a cream-colored envelope. Claire recognized it immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it from the stack and walked back inside the house. The envelope was thick. That was usually a good sign. She stared at it for a long moment before tearing it open with deliberate care. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper, addressed to her by name. She read it twice before allowing herself to react. She had not only been accepted, she had received the scholarship. Full tuition, a stipend, and a position in the school's advanced visual arts cohort. It was everything she had hoped for, and it meant she could leave. She stood in the hallway for a long time, the letter in her hand, unsure what to do next. Part of her wanted to rush to her room and cry in relief. Another part wanted to run to someone and shout the news. But there was no one in the house who would understand what this truly meant. Not just the scholarship, but the chance to start over, away from the suffocating indifference that had defined her life here. Eventually, she walked into the kitchen where Deborah sat sipping tea, flipping through a home design magazine. Claire placed the letter on the table in front of her mother without a word. Deborah glanced at it briefly before setting down her cup. "What's this?" she asked, lifting the page with 2 fingers. "My scholarship," Claire said. "I got in." Deborah's eyes skimmed the lines quickly, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she set the letter back down and folded the magazine shut with quiet precision. "That's quite a lot of money for an art degree," she said, "but if it's what you want." There was no smile, no excitement, no pride, just a passive acknowledgement, as though Claire had mentioned buying a new pair of shoes. Claire waited a moment, hoping for more, but Deborah returned to her magazine without another word. Claire walked away without responding. There was nothing left to say. The rest of the summer passed in a quiet rush of preparation. Claire filled out the paperwork, confirmed her housing, and purchased basic supplies. She did everything herself. She arranged transportation, ordered textbooks online, packed her belongings into 2 old suitcases she found in the basement. Deborah never offered help. She didn't ask about the campus or the classes or the people Claire would be living with. She didn't even ask when Claire would be leaving. The day of her departure arrived clear and warm. Claire stood at the foot of the stairs with her bags beside her, waiting to be acknowledged one last time. Deborah was in her study, pretending not to hear the quiet movements in the hallway. Claire waited a few more minutes, then turned the knob and stepped outside. She took a train out of Connecticut, watching the scenery blur past the window like pieces of a life she no longer needed to hold on to. The house, the silence, the cold elegance of her mother's world, it all felt distant now. Not because it no longer hurt, but because she had finally accepted that it would never change. Her leaving wasn't an act of defiance. It was survival. When she arrived at the campus, everything felt unreal. Students rushed around with backpacks and coffee cups, laughing, shouting, living. Claire moved among them quietly, a visitor from a different world. But for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. No one here knew her story. No one saw her as a mistake. She was just another student starting fresh. Her dorm room was small but warm, the walls bare, the air filled with the scent of new paint and unfamiliarity. She unpacked slowly, hanging up clothes, stacking sketchbooks on the desk, pinning a few photographs on the corkboard above her bed. One of the photos was a picture of her and her high school art teacher, taken at the end-of-year showcase. It reminded her of where she came from, and who had seen her when no one else had. Classes began a few days later, and Claire threw herself into her work with quiet intensity. The art program was demanding, filled with students who had trained for years, some with connections, others with privilege. But Claire's focus came from a different place. Every canvas she touched, every sculpture she shaped, was drawn from the ache she carried in her chest. Her pain became her palette, her history her material. Her professors noticed, so did her classmates. But no one asked why. They respected the depth of her work, without probing the source. In the evenings, Claire often walked the city streets near campus, sketching strangers in her notebook, capturing fleeting moments that might otherwise disappear. She found comfort in the anonymity, in the way people came and went without judgment. In the city, she was free to be whatever she chose. Occasionally, she would think of Deborah, not with longing, but with a complicated blend of sadness and clarity. She wondered if her mother noticed she was gone, if the house felt emptier now, if the silence had changed without someone there to absorb it. But she never called, and no calls came to her. Claire didn't need them. Her life was no longer shaped by what Deborah gave or withheld. She was creating something new from the pieces of herself she had been forced to guard for so long. One evening, weeks after her arrival, Claire received an envelope in the mail. It was postmarked from Connecticut, addressed in a script she recognized immediately, her mother's handwriting. Inside was a single card with a brief note. "I'm told you've arrived safely, that's good. No signature, no emotion, just 5 words written like a weather report." Claire stared at the card for a long moment, then placed it in a drawer. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't reread it either. She had already learned how to move forward without waiting for someone to walk beside her. Autumn descended on the city with a crispness that awakened something in Claire. The trees along the sidewalks blazed with color, their amber and crimson leaves painting the ground beneath her feet. The studio windows at her school fogged in the early mornings as students arrived with coffee in hand and brushes tucked behind their ears. Claire worked harder than ever, pouring herself into each assignment, shaping clay and stretching canvas like someone trying to build a voice from the ground up. She still spoke little about her past, but her work spoke for her. Professors encouraged her to apply for gallery apprenticeships. Her classmates sought her opinion on technique and tone. For the first time, Claire felt more than capable. She felt valuable. Weeks turned into months. She kept her distance from the past, though it returned to her occasionally in dreams. Half-formed images of staircases, echoing footsteps, the sound of her name said without affection. When she woke from these dreams, she would reach for her sketchbook and draw until morning broke, not to escape the memories but to empty them from her hands. Then one Monday afternoon in late November, as she returned to her apartment after class, Claire found a letter waiting for her in the mailbox downstairs. It was from a law firm in Hartford, the name unfamiliar. The envelope was stiff and formal, and something about it made her stomach twist. Inside was a short printed notice. Deborah Matthews had passed away. Claire read the sentence 3 times before it landed fully in her chest. No details, no explanation, just a statement of fact. Accompanying it was a second page, Deborah's will. Claire had been named the sole heir. She stood in the lobby of her building, the letter in her hand, the city moving around her without pause. Cars honked, a bicycle bell rang, a child screamed in delight. All of it continued as if the world hadn't just tilted. Claire didn't feel grief in the traditional sense. She felt something closer to weightlessness, like she had been detached from the ground beneath her. Her mother was gone, and she had left everything to the daughter she had once refused to acknowledge. It was surreal, absurd, ironic. She took the elevator to her apartment and sat down on the edge of her bed, staring at the document. It named her clearly, Claire Elise Matthews, sole heir, sole beneficiary, executor of the estate. There were figures listed, numbers she could barely process, values attached to properties and accounts she had never known existed. The language was sterile, but the meaning behind it was impossible to ignore. Her mother, who had once declared her a regret in front of strangers, had now entrusted her with everything she had owned. There was no letter enclosed, no note, no final explanation, just a line at the bottom of the legal document indicating that Claire would need to appear at the estate office in Connecticut within 30 days to formally accept or decline the inheritance. For a long time, Claire didn't move. She sat with the letter in her lap, the paper cold against her skin. Her mind raced through memories like snapshots. Deborah at the kitchen table, Deborah walking through the garden without a word, Deborah's voice saying those unforgettable words, "Just a mistake I regret." None of it aligned with what she was reading now. Nothing made sense. Over the next few days, she told no one. She went to class, she sketched, she read. But inside, something had shifted. She felt a pull, not toward reconciliation, not toward closure, but toward understanding. She had left home expecting never to return. Now she was being summoned back not by love or grief, but by obligation, by legacy, by whatever truth had been buried beneath the silence her mother had maintained to the very end. Claire booked her train ticket 3 days later. She told her professors she would miss a week for family reasons and packed a single suitcase. The return to Connecticut felt like a journey through time. The trees looked older, the houses colder, even the streets seemed steeper than she remembered. When she stepped off the train and hailed a cab to the estate office, she was struck by how different everything felt. She was no longer the girl who had sat in that grand house, waiting for her mother to love her. She was someone else now, still healing, still searching, but no longer invisible. The office was housed in a tall, quiet building, lined with dark wood and framed certificates. A man in a grey suit greeted her with polite efficiency and led her to a private room. The will was read aloud, though Claire already knew the contents. There were no surprises, no hidden clauses. Deborah had left her everything, the house, the accounts, the stocks, the jewelry. The lawyer's voice was calm, mechanical, as he listed the assets. But Claire's mind wandered to the last time she had stood in her mother's study, watching her sip wine with that same distant gaze. When the reading ended, the lawyer handed her an envelope. "This was found with the estate documents," he said. "It's addressed to you." Claire took the envelope slowly. Her name was written in Deborah's handwriting, the letters neat and unmistakable. She didn't open it right away. She placed it in her bag and thanked the lawyer. Outside, the wind had picked up. It was colder than she had expected. She checked into a small inn near her old neighborhood and sat on the bed, the envelope in her hands. She stared at it for nearly an hour before she broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in longhand. "Claire, if you are reading this, I am gone. I imagine that brings you more relief than pain, and I don't blame you. I never said what I should have. I never gave what I should have. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want you to know that I was aware of everything, of you. I did not know how to love properly. I thought if I kept things controlled and quiet, I could be a better mother than my own had been to me. But in doing so, I erased parts of you I had no right to erase. You are not a mistake. You never were. I was afraid of being a mother, of failing, of losing control. I chose silence over honesty, and that silence became a wall I never had the courage to climb. I cannot change what I was. I can only give you what I have left. Not because I believe it makes up for the past, but because it is yours. Use it for something true. Deborah Clare read the letter twice, then 3 more times. Each line added weight and lightness in equal measure. She did not cry. She did not feel sudden forgiveness or peace, but she felt seen, finally, strangely, painfully. The message was cold in its delivery, but within it there was a flicker of something she had never expected. Admission. And in that admission, a kind of truth. It wasn't love, but it was real. The taxi slowed as it turned onto the winding road that led to the Matthews estate. The house came into view gradually, its tall windows catching the late afternoon light, its perfectly trimmed hedges still standing like sentinels at the edge of the driveway. Claire sat with her hands in her lap, staring through the window in silence. It had been over 2 years since she'd last seen this place, and yet everything looked exactly as she remembered. Time had not touched the structure. It remained cold, grand, and distant, like the woman who had once inhabited it. The driver stopped at the edge of the circular drive. Claire stepped out without a word, her suitcase in hand. The house stood still before her, as if holding its breath. She took one slow step forward, then another, each footfall echoing through the hollowness of her memory. The air was sharper here, the silence deeper. She unlocked the door with a key provided by the estate lawyer. It turned easily, like the house had been waiting. As she stepped inside, the scent hit her, a mix of old books, polished wood, and something faintly floral that had always lingered in Deborah's presence. The silence inside was not just an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, as though the walls remembered everything they had absorbed. Claire moved through the foyer, past the grand staircase, and into the living room. The furniture was still arranged with geometric precision, the paintings perfectly aligned, the vases undisturbed. It was as if Deborah had simply stepped out and never returned. Even the cushions on the sofa held their rigid posture. Claire stood in the center of the room, unsure what to feel. There was no comfort in being back, but there was no fear either. Only clarity. She spent the first evening walking through the rooms, not touching anything, just observing. Her old bedroom remained untouched, an eerie preservation of a life once half-lived. The bed was still made with the same linen. The desk held the same unused notebooks, the curtains drawn just slightly open, as if still waiting for her return. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, not with nostalgia, but with distance. The next morning, Claire met with the estate attorney once more at the study. He handed her a final set of documents to sign and reviewed the list of items and properties included in her inheritance. Deborah had owned not just the house, but also several investment accounts, a small vineyard property upstate, and a trust that had been closed after Claire's legal acceptance. The numbers were staggering. She had always known her mother was wealthy, but the scale of her assets revealed a life of quiet accumulation that had never translated into generosity of spirit. After the meeting, Claire returned to the house and began the process of sorting. She moved room to room with methodical intent. She wasn't there to mourn, nor to memorialize. She was there to confront. In every drawer, every file cabinet, every photo frame, there were remnants of Deborah's carefully constructed world, pristine, intentional, empty of warmth. Claire placed certain items in boxes to be donated, others to be sold. She kept only what held some whisper of truth: the letters, the journals, the few photographs that proved their history had existed at all. Word of her return spread quickly through extended family and old acquaintances. Claire received a string of messages, mostly formal and filled with concealed curiosity. Cousins she hadn't spoken to in years reached out with polite condolences. A few hinted at surprise that she had been named the sole heir. Some made veiled references to old promises Deborah had once made, gifts discussed, properties mentioned. Claire responded to none of them. The only invitation she accepted was from the lawyer who organized a final will reading for the extended relatives who had been listed as witnesses or former beneficiaries. Claire knew it would be awkward, perhaps even tense, but she agreed to attend. Not for them, for herself. There was something she needed to say, and she wanted them to hear it. On the day of the reading, the room filled slowly with people dressed in quiet elegance. They sat in high-backed chairs, their postures formal, their expressions expectant. Claire stood at the side of the room watching them. Some she recognized, faces from childhood events, distant holidays, names she barely recalled. Most of them looked past her or through her, as if she were a stranger who had stumbled into a private affair. The lawyer began with routine formalities, reviewing the legal aspects of the will and reaffirming Deborah's clear designation of Claire as sole beneficiary. Murmurs rustled through the room. A few glances shifted toward her, but no one spoke. Claire waited until the last line had been read, the final clause explained. Then, without prompting, she stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her tone. She simply began to speak. "She told me once that I was a mistake she regretted," she said. She laughed when she said it as if it were a harmless joke. I didn't laugh. The room grew still. No one interrupted. No one moved. She raised me with rules and routine, with silence, with absence. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know how. I spent years trying to earn her love, thinking I was the one who had failed. But I wasn't. I was never the problem. Claire paused, letting the silence settle around her. She left me everything. Her house, her money, her name. But none of those things are why I'm here. I came back because I needed to understand. And I did. I understand now that love isn't measured by inheritance or appearances. It's measured by presence, by truth, and by the courage to say what should have been said long ago. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. I am not her mistake. I am her legacy. Whether you like that or not. Then she turned and walked out. The wind met her outside the office, carrying the sharpness of winter in its breath. Claire pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the street without looking back. She had said what needed to be said, not for them, not even for Deborah, but for herself. She would stay in Connecticut only a few more days, just long enough to finalize the sale of the house and arrange donations. After that, she would return to the city, to her life, to her work, to a world she had begun to build with her own hands. The return home had not brought healing, not in the traditional sense, but it had brought closure. And for Claire, that was enough. The house felt different after the will reading, not because anything had physically changed, but because the weight of secrecy had finally been acknowledged. The air was no longer thick with the tension of unspoken words. There was still silence, but now it was a quieter kind, the kind that follows the end of a storm. Claire moved through the rooms with more confidence, no longer walking like a visitor or an intruder. She belonged to the space now, not because it welcomed her, but because it was hers by right. The days following the reading were spent in steady solitude. She continued the process of sorting, organizing, and discarding. She had grown detached from the objects around her. The antique furniture, the custom drapes, the curated art hanging on the walls. All of it spoke more of Deborah's taste than her life. Claire kept only a few things: a leather-bound journal found in her mother's nightstand, a collection of art books marked with quiet annotations, and a pair of sketching pencils still in their original case. Everything else was catalogued for auction or donation. It was on the third morning, while emptying the large wardrobe in the master bedroom, that Claire found the letter. It had been tucked beneath a folded stack of scarves, hidden in a flat, narrow envelope that bore no markings except for a single line in Deborah's script: "To Claire, when you're ready." Her heart stilled for a moment. She held the envelope in her hands, the paper aged slightly at the edges, the seal intact. It was thinner than the previous letter, more personal perhaps. The tone of the inscription struck her. It did not assume she would ever open it. It allowed for hesitation, for refusal. Deborah had written it with uncertainty, which made it feel all the more real. Claire didn't open it immediately. She carried it downstairs to the sunroom, the one space in the house that had ever felt like her own, and sat by the window, watching the branches sway against the pale sky. The letter rested on her lap for a long time. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope, as if trying to guess the words inside before letting them speak for themselves. Finally, with a careful breath, she broke the seal. "My Claire, if you're reading this, then something within you wanted to understand me, not to excuse me and certainly not to forgive, but to know what I was too afraid to share while I was alive. This letter isn't meant to undo what I did or didn't do. It's not an apology in the way you deserve. It's only a reflection from someone who spent a lifetime hiding her own truth. I struggled with love, with closeness, with the weight of motherhood. I wish I could blame it on something clear and tragic, but the truth is more ordinary than that. I was afraid of being needed, afraid of not being enough, afraid of giving and not knowing what would be left of me after. I didn't know how to be a mother, and I thought pretending would be better than admitting that. I thought control could replace affection, that order could replace connection. But you saw through me, didn't you? You always did. You were so perceptive, even as a child. I saw it in your eyes, in the way you watched me, searching for something I couldn't give. I saw it in the way you started to pull away, little by little, when you realized your efforts weren't being returned. And I saw it in the strength you carried, even in silence. There were moments I wanted to reach for you, truly. Moments when I stood outside your door with my hand raised, trying to find the courage to knock, but I always convinced myself that it was better not to disturb the fragile balance we had found, that saying something now would only highlight how long I had said nothing. I want you to know this, Claire, I did care. I know it doesn't sound like enough, it's not, but I did. You weren't invisible to me, you weren't unwanted. You frightened me, because you were vivid and real and feeling. You represented everything I was never taught how to hold, but you were never a mistake. Not for a second. I'm sorry that I never told you this while I had the chance, that my pride and fear kept me frozen, that my legacy to you was absence when it should have been presence. I hope in whatever way you choose you live without that silence. I hope you fill your life with sound and color, and people who remind you every day that you are seen. You deserve that. You always have. Take what I left you and use it well, not to remember me, but to reclaim yourself. With what love I was able to hold. Your mother Claire sat for a long time after finishing. The letter lay open in her lap, the ink slightly smudged where her fingers had lingered. Her eyes were dry, but her chest ached, not with grief but with recognition. This was the mother she had always suspected existed beneath the surface, the woman who had felt too much and expressed too little. The woman who had mistaken control for care and silence for strength. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her sketchbook, between 2 pages filled with unfinished lines. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years of distance, but it gave her something she had never expected to receive from Deborah: humanity. Not perfection, not warmth, but truth. That evening, Claire stood in the garden at dusk, wrapped in an old cardigan she had found in a box marked for donation. The air was crisp, the sky painted with fading light. She looked up at the house one last time, not as a place of pain, but as a chapter, one that had closed with more honesty than it began. She didn't speak aloud. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The past was still hers, but it no longer owned her. When Claire returned to New York, the city greeted her not with ceremony, but with motion. Horns blared, pedestrians moved with purpose, and the hum of life continued, uninterrupted. She stepped off the train into the chaos, suitcase in hand, the unopened letter still resting inside her journal like a quiet ember. The days in Connecticut already felt distant, like a film she had watched in silence, only to realize afterward that she had been in every scene. Back in her small apartment, she unpacked slowly. She placed the journal on her desk without opening it again. There was no need to reread her mother's final words. They had already imprinted themselves somewhere deeper. Instead, she turned to her canvas, to her brushes, to the textures that had always spoken for her when words failed. But something was different now. Her movements were no longer fueled by pain alone. There was still sadness, but it had changed shape. It no longer hovered like a shadow at her back. It had become part of her process, integrated, softened, and strangely empowering. She returned to her classes where her professors noticed a shift in her work. Her colors were bolder. her themes clearer. There was a new kind of presence in her pieces, something undeniable that drew attention without effort. She didn't talk about what had happened. She didn't need to. Her work had become her voice, and through it she spoke volumes. One of her professors invited her to participate in a group exhibition at a local gallery. It was a modest venue, but the offer carried weight. It was her first public showing outside the school. Claire accepted without hesitation. She spent the next 3 weeks preparing, selecting pieces that told her story, not through biography, but through emotional truth. She included 3 new works inspired directly by the experience of returning home. They were not literal, but they carried within them the textures of her past: shadows, light through glass, an open door with no figure in the frame. On the night of the exhibition, Claire arrived early. The gallery was small but well lit, its white walls providing a blank canvas for every emotion displayed. Visitors began to filter in as the evening progressed. Friends from her program, professors, a few art collectors. They moved slowly through the space, pausing at her work, leaning in, stepping back, tilting their heads in quiet contemplation. Claire stood in the corner, watching. She didn't speak unless someone approached her directly, but she observed how they reacted, how some lingered, how others turned to each other with whispered comments. And then, unexpectedly, someone asked the question that struck deeper than the rest. "Who is this about?" Claire hesitated only for a moment. "It's about someone who tried to build a life from silence," she said, "and someone else who chose to break it." The woman nodded thoughtfully and moved on. That night, after the gallery closed, Claire walked through the city alone. The wind had turned colder, and her coat wasn't thick enough, but she welcomed the sensation. It kept her anchored. She passed a mural on the side of a building she hadn't noticed before, an explosion of color across brick and concrete, chaotic but beautiful. She stopped and stared at it for several minutes, wondering who had created it, what had driven them to paint that story on such an unforgiving surface. In that moment, she understood something that had eluded her before. Art wasn't just a form of escape or expression. It was resistance. It was reclamation. It was the act of taking control over a narrative that others had tried to define. She returned to her apartment with an idea she couldn't ignore. She wanted to create a space, not just for herself, but for others like her. A place where voices could be found, where silence wasn't the end, but the beginning. The thought grew quietly over the next few weeks, taking root as she sketched out possibilities in her notebook. She didn't have all the details yet. She didn't know where or how it would happen, but she knew why. That was enough to start. As winter approached, Claire began the process of planning. She contacted local community centers, explored grant opportunities, and spoke with artists who had once lived through disconnection like hers. The more she researched, the more she realized how many people longed for that kind of space, a haven for those whose stories had been silenced or forgotten. She thought of the money her mother had left her, the assets she had inherited without asking. It no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a tool. She would use what Deborah had given her, not as a reward, not as restitution, but as material, not for revenge, not for approval, but for purpose. One evening, while reorganizing a shelf in her apartment, Claire found an old photo tucked between books. It showed her at around 5 years old, standing in the backyard of the Connecticut house. Her hair was messy, her expression uncertain. Deborah stood in the background, eyes elsewhere. Claire stared at the image for a long time before sliding it into the back of her journal. She no longer needed to rewrite the past, but she could build something new from its remains. A few weeks later, she submitted her proposal to a small arts foundation. The application was straightforward, the mission clear: a community studio space that prioritized emotional expression through visual art, open to anyone regardless of skill or background. She included samples of her work, excerpts from her artist's statement, and a personal note. This project was born from silence. It now exists to make sure others find their voice. She didn't expect an immediate response, but she received one 2 weeks later, a meeting invitation. As she sat in the office of the foundation's director, explaining her vision, Claire felt no fear, only conviction. The director listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the portfolio in her hands. When Claire finished, the woman closed the folder and met her gaze directly. "You're not just building an art space," she said. You're reclaiming a life. I think we can help you." Claire left the meeting with more than just approval. She left with affirmation. What had begun as a wound had become a purpose. What had once been isolation had become connection. And for the first time, Claire felt not just free, but full. The final will reading was held in a quiet, sunlit room in the office of Green and Wakefield, a long-standing law firm nestled between banks and boutique stores in downtown Hartford. The building was old, its structure stately and unchanged by time, as if designed to lend a sense of permanence to the impermanence of legal affairs. Claire arrived early, dressed in a plain grey coat, her posture steady. She did not come with anger or resentment. She came with clarity. The waiting area was filled with soft murmurs and rustling papers. A few extended relatives she vaguely recognized from earlier years sat in stiff chairs, their expressions guarded. There were others too, people who had floated around Deborah's social circle, some who had attended events at the Matthews house, others who seemed surprised to be there at all. Claire acknowledged no one. She took her seat quietly, eyes on the polished floor. When the doors opened and the attendees were ushered inside, the atmosphere shifted from casual to formal. They were seated in rows facing a long table where the estate attorney, Mr. Rayner, adjusted his glasses and began organizing the necessary documents. A few individuals leaned toward one another, whispering theories about what might be included, their voices low but not silent. Mr. Rayner cleared his throat. "This will reading will be brief," he began. "The contents of Deborah Matthews' estate have been reviewed and verified. The primary beneficiary has already been legally recognized and accepted the terms. Today's meeting is procedural, to communicate the final dispositions and formalize closure." There was a brief pause as he looked around the room. "Claire Elise Matthews is the sole heir to the entire estate. All real property, financial accounts, personal effects, and remaining assets have been transferred to her, in accordance with the final version of the will signed and notarized on February 4th of this year." A hush fell across the room. One woman raised her hand slightly. "There was no charitable trust? No distributions?" Mr. Rayner shook his head. "All other designations in previous drafts were removed. There are no additional beneficiaries named." A man near the back let out a breath, half disbelief, half annoyance. Several attendees exchanged glances. No one spoke directly to Claire, though their eyes drifted toward her, some with pity, others with bitterness. Claire remained unmoved. The deceased left a letter to accompany the formal will. Mr. Rayner continued, "This letter is addressed to Ms. Matthews, but will be read aloud with her permission." Claire gave a single nod. Mr. Rayner unfolded the letter and began to read. "To those gathered, if you are here, it is because you were once part of my world. You attended my dinners, wrote me letters, shook my hand at functions, and in many cases, believed you understood who I was. You did not. The woman you knew was careful, deliberate, and often distant. I cultivated distance because I did not know how to do anything else. I wore politeness like armor and generosity like currency. But I did not live as fully as I should have. I did not connect. I did not reach. And in doing so, I failed the person who most deserved to know me, my daughter. To Claire, I leave what I failed to offer in life, the resources to build something real, not in my name, but in your own. I do not expect forgiveness, and I do not ask for remembrance. I ask only that you use what I left behind to build the life I was too afraid to live. To everyone else, I leave no further explanation. You will interpret this however you choose, but know that my decision was not made lightly. Claire is not a placeholder. She is not a convenient name in a document. She is the person who taught me too late what presence means. This is her legacy now, not mine." Mr. Rayner finished reading and folded the paper again. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence in the room grew thick, not with mourning but with discomfort. The carefully constructed image of Deborah Matthews had been peeled away, revealing something more complex than most had ever guessed. Claire remained still in her chair. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead. She felt no vindication in the letter, no triumph, only the weight of words that had come too late. But still, they mattered. When the room was dismissed, the murmuring resumed, this time sharper, more urgent. A few individuals moved toward Claire, hesitating as if unsure what to say. One distant cousin extended a hand, then thought better of it and turned away. Another guest, a former business partner of Deborah's, offered a tight smile and a shallow nod before departing. Claire stood slowly, collecting her coat. Mr. Rayner approached her. "There will be some paperwork still," he said quietly. "Transfers to finalize. We can arrange a schedule that works around your residency." She nodded. "Thank you." As she walked through the hallway toward the building's exit, she passed a photograph hanging on the wall. It was a portrait of a woman in her 40s, standing beside a younger version of herself, a mother and daughter framed in black and white. Claire paused. The expression on the daughter's face mirrored her own from years ago, waiting, uncertain, hopeful. Outside, the sky was clear. The cold air struck her cheeks as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. Back in New York, her studio awaited. The community space she had dreamed of was beginning to take shape. The lease had been signed. Volunteers were already preparing the first wall to be painted with a mural designed by neighborhood kids. The furniture was being sourced, supplies donated. There was life waiting for her there, raw, loud, imperfect, but real. The will was a turning point, not because of the wealth it transferred, but because of the truth it revealed. Deborah had finally acknowledged what Claire had always known in her bones. That legacy is not about property or prestige. It is about truth, about what is passed on and what is let go. Claire had been handed the remnants of her mother's life. Now she would use them to build something entirely her own. The gallery was quiet just before the doors opened. Claire stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the soft echoes of footsteps and final preparations. Paintings hung in clean rows along the white walls. Sculptures stood on plinths, each piece lit with intention. The exhibit was called Inheritance, and it was her first solo show. Every piece was a part of her, and yet none of it was about her mother, not directly. Deborah was not the subject of the work, but her absence was present in every brushstroke, every line, every space left unfinished. The gallery was located in a reclaimed warehouse in Brooklyn, a part of the city that had long belonged to artists who found expression in forgotten corners. Claire had chosen it for that very reason. She wanted her story to exist in a place that wasn't polished, that hadn't been curated to perfection like the home she'd grown up in. This space was imperfect, raw, and honest. It reflected everything she had fought to become. As the first guests arrived, Claire took her place near the entrance. She didn't make announcements. She didn't guide tours. She simply stood back and let the work speak. People moved slowly through the space, reading placards, stepping close to examine texture, pausing before moving on. There were moments of stillness where someone lingered too long at a particular painting. Their expression caught somewhere between confusion and recognition. A journalist approached her an hour into the evening, notebook in hand. "Your work has a deeply personal tone," he said. "It speaks to abandonment, transformation, legacy. Would you say this is an autobiographical collection?" Claire considered the question carefully. "It's about what happens when silence is inherited," she said, "and what it means to break that cycle." The journalist nodded, scribbling notes. "And the title, Inheritance, do you see this as a response to that legacy?" "Yes," Claire said, "but not in the way people expect. It's not about claiming what was left to me. It's about choosing what I refuse to carry." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You've taken a very public step with this show. It's personal, but it's also confrontational. Do you ever worry about how the people connected to your past might interpret it?" Claire met his gaze with calm certainty. "They already did their part," she said. "Now it's my turn." Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Claire stood before one particular painting. A large canvas dominated by shadows and soft outlines of doorways receding into darkness. It was untitled. She had debated calling it Mistake or Regret, but those names felt too narrow. Instead, she had let the silence speak. The painting didn't offer resolution. It invited reflection. That was enough. A group of distant relatives had attended the opening. Claire had seen them earlier, clustered near the back, whispering, watching. Some had expected to be acknowledged, perhaps even embraced now that she stood on her own. She had offered them only the same silence they had shown her years before. One of them, a cousin she remembered from childhood summers, finally approached her. He wore a conservative suit and carried a drink he hadn't touched. "You've done well for yourself," he said. Your mother would be. Surprised. Claire smiled slightly. She often was. She left you everything, he said, his tone measured. We all heard the will, but I think some people thought it was symbolic. You know, a gesture. I didn't expect you to build all this. Claire turned fully toward him. Her voice was steady. I didn't build this from what she gave me. I built it from what she didn't. He blinked, unsure how to respond. Then he offered a shallow nod and walked away. At the center of the gallery, a small crowd had gathered. They were engaged in conversation, not about money or inheritance, but about art, about emotion, about honesty. Claire joined them, listened to their thoughts, their interpretations. None of them asked about her mother. They asked about colors, materials, choices. They saw her. When the evening drew to a close, the gallery lights dimmed, and the final guests drifted out into the night. Claire remained behind, locking the door and turning off the last of the lights. She stood alone in the darkened space, lit only by the ambient glow of the city outside. It was quiet, not the suffocating silence of her childhood home, but a peaceful stillness. She felt no ghosts here, only presence. As she walked back to her apartment, the cold air brushing her skin, she thought again of the moment in the lawyer's office, surrounded by those who had looked at her like an intruder. She remembered standing, words forming on her tongue, voice firm, not from anger but from truth. You may not claim me, she had said, but your millions did. The room had gone silent. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. I will not carry your shame. I will not apologize for surviving you. There had been no response. Only the shifting of suits in leather chairs, the rustling of papers, the tightening of jaws. But Claire had not spoken for them. She had spoken for the girl who once sat quietly at the edge of a couch while her mother laughed and called her a mistake. She had spoken for herself. Now, as she stepped inside her home, kicked off her shoes and sat by the window with a cup of tea, she let the silence surround her again. But this time, it was hers. Not inherited. Not forced. Just quiet, open space. The kind that allows things to grow. The building was a narrow, two-story structure nestled between a laundromat and a bookstore in Brooklyn. Its brick facade bore the fading scars of decades past. Old paint, rusted signage, uneven mortar. But where others might have seen age and wear, Claire saw potential. She had walked past it dozens of times before the idea took hold, before she stood outside the gated entrance and imagined what it could become. Now, months later, it was hers. Not in theory, not on paper, but in reality. Renovations began modestly. She hired a team of local contractors and volunteers from the neighborhood, artists, teachers, students, and retirees who had heard about the project through word of mouth or her modest social media posts. The space was to be called The Open Frame, a community art studio dedicated to expression, healing, and connection. Claire used the money left to her not as a monument to Deborah's memory, but as fuel for something radically different, a space of inclusion where no one would be dismissed or diminished. The ground floor was converted into a gallery and workshop space, with wide tables for classes, storage for supplies, and large movable walls for exhibitions. The upstairs, once a derelict office, was reimagined as a quiet studio for personal use and reflection. The front windows were replaced to let in more light. The flooring was refinished. Every choice was deliberate, practical, and human. The first weeks were a blur of paint cans, sanding tools, and late nights sketching floor plans with volunteers over coffee. Claire worked alongside everyone, lifting, scrubbing, framing walls with her sleeves rolled up and hands stained with dust and ink. She didn't issue commands. She shared labor, and because of that, others believed in the vision just as much as she did. Once the foundation had been laid, she began designing the programming: open studio hours, art therapy sessions, children's classes, community-led exhibits, workshops for survivors of trauma. The space would be open to all, regardless of income, experience, or education. No resumes, no portfolios, just people and their stories. The local press picked up the story after one of her volunteers, an aspiring journalist, submitted a piece to a neighborhood circular. Soon, donations started to come in. Nothing extravagant, but enough to keep the project alive. A retired school teacher sent a box of unused paint. A college student offered to lead a weekly sketch club. A mother of 3 dropped off old canvases and stayed to help sweep the floor. Claire didn't seek recognition, but recognition found her. A curator from a larger Brooklyn gallery visited one afternoon and quietly walked through the workshop, watching a group of teenagers paint a mural on the back wall. Afterward, she approached Claire with a card and an invitation. "We're hosting a show on spaces of resilience," the curator said. "I think you belong in it." Claire smiled but did not immediately answer. She no longer measured her worth by exhibitions or appearances. Still, the invitation meant something, not for ego, but as evidence that the world outside this building saw what was happening inside it. Weeks passed, and the studio blossomed. On Saturday mornings, children gathered to finger paint while their parents drank coffee and talked. In the evenings, older students shared stories through charcoal sketches and collage. No one asked about each other's past unless it was offered. There was no demand for disclosure, only space for it. Claire led some of the workshops herself, but often preferred to move among the people, observing, encouraging, organizing materials quietly while others found their voices. It was enough to know the place was being used, that it mattered. One afternoon, a young girl approached her with a painting clutched to her chest. The image was abstract, but rich with color, vivid reds, stormy purples, an explosion of brightness in the center. "I don't know what it means," the girl said, eyes downcast. Claire knelt beside her, studying the piece carefully. "You don't have to know," she said. "Sometimes art understands us before we understand ourselves." The girl looked up. For a moment, something passed between them, recognition without words. Claire had seen that look in the mirror for years, in the drawings she had once hidden under her bed, in the faces of strangers who came to the studio seeking something they couldn't name. In those moments, she felt most certain of what she had built. The studio's first exhibition was held in the spring. Instead of curating a formal show, Claire let the community decide. Participants chose which works to hang, wrote their own titles, arranged the pieces however they pleased. There were no themes, no central narrative, just a collection of lives expressed through paint, clay, photography, and found objects. Claire contributed one piece. It was a mixed media installation, a frame suspended in the center of the room with no canvas inside, just empty space. Around it hung fragments of text, handwritten notes, old photographs, scraps of her mother's final letter, carefully copied onto strips of vellum. It was not an accusation. It was not a eulogy. It was a mirror, inviting others to step forward and see not the artist, but themselves. At the end of the night, an older man lingered near the piece, staring at it with his hands in his pockets. "It's unfinished," he said quietly. Claire stood beside him. "Exactly," she replied. He nodded once and walked away. Outside, the city moved on. Buses, lights, sirens, the pulse of lives intertwined. Inside the studio, the walls remained lit long after the guests had gone, the artwork still breathing in the stillness. Claire locked the door and stood for a moment in the quiet. She no longer felt the absence of her mother like a whole. It had become something else, something less jagged, more muted. A fact, not a force. She returned upstairs to the studio, pulled a blank canvas onto the easel, and began to paint. Not for Deborah, not for legacy, not even for healing. For herself. Years passed quietly, not with the slow weight of endurance, but with the steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. Claire never sought to erase her past. She didn't hide it or reshape it into something prettier than it was. Instead, she carried it as one might carry a scar, visible, real, but no longer painful to the touch. The open frame grew from a modest community studio into something more enduring. It became a haven for those in transition, a second home for artists without credentials, for young people without direction, for older ones rediscovering themselves through the medium of creation. It was not defined by galleries or grants, though those came. It was defined by presence. Every inch of the space bore the mark of hands that had once trembled, voices that had once faltered, eyes that had once doubted whether they deserved to be seen. Claire became a quiet leader. She taught when needed, stepped back when others needed to lead, and ensured the walls never went empty. New murals replaced old ones. Art evolved with seasons and with the moods of those who entered. She resisted permanence. The space was not a monument. It was a living process. One day, as spring edged into early summer, Claire arrived at the studio with a small box in her arms. Inside it were items she had long kept stored away, a few of her mother's letters, a photograph of the two of them from years ago, a small ring that had belonged to Deborah's grandmother. Claire had no intention of displaying them. She brought them to give herself a choice, not to discard or to reframe them, but to integrate them. She cleared a spot on a shelf near her office and arranged the items without ceremony. The photo she placed behind a glass bookend, half hidden. The ring she set in a bowl with other found objects. The letters remained inside the box, the lid closed. It was not a shrine. It was not an act of reverence. It was acknowledgement. The story was not just hers. It was shared, however painfully. People often asked her in interviews or artist talks if she had forgiven her mother. The question always came from those who believed healing required it. Claire never answered with absolutes. Forgiveness isn't the goal, she would say. Understanding is, and she meant it. Deborah had left her with silence, but also with a chance to choose a different legacy. Claire had taken it not as inheritance, but as material. The coldness, the detachment, the emotional distance, they became tools she had repurposed into warmth, into connection, into visibility. On the 5th anniversary of the studio's opening, Claire organized a commemorative installation titled Names Not Spoken. It was a collective piece composed of contributions from over 100 participants. Each had submitted a word, phrase, or memory they had never shared aloud. Grief, joy, confusion, gratitude, written anonymously on strips of cloth. The pieces were sewn together into a cascading tapestry that hung from the ceiling to the floor in the center of the main room. Visitors were invited to walk through the folds, touch the fabric, read the entries, and, if they chose, add their own. Claire contributed a single line. "I waited for a kind of love that never came, and I survived anyway." The tapestry became the heart of the exhibit, not because of its size or intricacy, but because of its quiet strength. It did not demand understanding. It offered space for it. Later that summer, a former professor visited the studio. She hadn't seen Claire since her final year at university and had followed her journey from a distance. "You've created something rare," the professor said. "Something lasting." Claire smiled, hands tucked into her paint-stained apron. "I didn't want to keep telling the story the way it was given to me," she replied. "So I wrote a new one." Not long after, she was invited to give a talk at a conference on art and emotional literacy. She stood on stage in front of educators, artists, therapists, and students, not to explain her work, but to explain its roots. "I was raised in a house where nothing was said aloud," Claire told them, "where presence was mistaken for love and silence for strength. For a long time, I thought healing meant changing the past. But healing is living beyond it, without letting it define every step." The room was quiet, not from discomfort, but from reflection. "I used to believe that if I became successful, I would finally prove I was worthy. But success is not a cure. What matters is how we choose to show up for others, and for ourselves, when no one is watching. That is what breaks cycles." When the applause came, Claire bowed her head once, not for acknowledgement, but in gratitude. That night, back in her apartment, she stood at the window and looked out across the city. Lights flickered in high-rises. Trains passed in the distance. Somewhere down the block, laughter rose from an open window. She was not lonely. She was not waiting for a voice that never came. She was here, fully, finally. On the gallery wall near the studio entrance, she mounted a single photograph. It showed Deborah Matthews standing near a window in her youth, light falling across her face, eyes turned towards something unseen. It was the only photo Claire displayed, not as tribute, but as recognition. Deborah had been many things, flawed, distant, afraid, but she had also been real, and that truth mattered. Claire did not hate her mother. She did not canonize her either. She allowed her to exist in memory without bitterness, without denial, just honesty. The story had not ended with rejection. It had not ended with inheritance. It had ended with choice. Claire had chosen creation over silence, purpose over pain, and compassion over resentment, and in that choice healing had found her.